Welcome to Global Lens, conversation with Professor Doug Guthrie. Today, we're discussing the escalating tensions between elite private colleges and the federal government. Doug, with the funding freeze at Cornell, my own alma mater, Northwestern, and high-profile standoff with Harvard and Columbia, there is so much to unpack.
Absolutely. I mean, this is just such an amazingly important topic right now, Christine. And as our listeners and followers know, we've been trying to expand beyond just China in the news and really sort of think about more broader issues about global leadership. And so today, Global Lens, we're talking about leadership in incredibly important institutions like Harvard and Columbia and your own alma mater, Northwestern and Cornell. And I mean, this is a really, really interesting and important time. And so I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you.
Thanks so much. Harvard University rejected a series of sweeping demands from the Trump administration, which includes relinquishing control over hiring, admissions and instruction, halting recognition of certain student groups, and reporting foreign students who violated university policies. In response, the administration froze $2 billion in funding, threatened Harvard's tax exempt status, and its ability to enroll foreign students. On Monday, April 21st, Harvard University announced that it has filed lawsuit to halt a federal freeze in grants. Then, the last few days, the Trump administration appears open to negotiations with Harvard, even after America's most prestigious university decided to fight. And I would say this is David versus David, not David versus Goliath. I want to even call out this thread post where a Yale graduate donated to Harvard for the first time. This really reflects a broad support for Harvard as it confronts the Trump administration's recent actions. So, Doug, thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, as I was just saying a few minutes ago, Christine, I mean, this is such an important moment, and Harvard's refusal to back down is really a case of moral leadership. And it's moral leadership in an incredibly important sector of our society. I mean, universities of or institutions of higher education and learning. I mean, these are the bedrock of how we generate knowledge and how we have a society that's built around issues like freedom of speech, freedom of thought. And so this is about defending the core values of academic freedom and institutional autonomy. And the stakes are incredibly high. And so let's dive in. This is really important.
Thanks. Harvard's president Alan Garber has been adamant saying that no private university can allow itself to be taken over by the federal government. On the other hand, Columbia agreed to install government mandated oversight in some of its academic departments. They made concessions to avoid losing funding. What does this say about decision made by these two different Ivy League schools?
Well, I have to say, first of all, I admire Harvard for standing their ground. And I'm disappointed that Columbia has chosen the route that it's taking. I mean, to take a step back before I do a comparison between the two, I mean, I really believe that this is a crisis for American leadership and American society. I mean, what the Trump administration is doing right now is just abhorrent. Because again, the institutions of higher education are such an important bedrock of American society, not just because of the great research that's done in these places, but also because they teach our children and our doctoral students and our master's students how to think freely and how to think openly and how to really have democratic values that value um, ideas over just kind of catering to the wealthy. And so the Trump administration seems to be really moving in an authoritarian direction. And so what we want to see is our institutions of higher learning stand up to this, right? I mean, the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of thought is such a core idea to how universities are built. And so the fact that Harvard is standing its ground, I think, is laudable. And the fact that Columbia has caved, I think, is very sad. Now, there are differences between these places. One very basic issue is you can think about the resources. I think Columbia's endowment is about 15 billion and Harvard's is, I think last year topped 50 billion. And so so maybe this is a resource question. And it just, when Columbia's leadership was looking at the issues, they just didn't have as much cushion as Harvard did. Maybe. That being said, it's also really important to note, and as you know, I've been in university administration for a while in my life. I was the dean of the business school at George Washington University, and I've been around institutions of higher education for my entire career. And one of the things that you imagine as a professor, that we are these institutions of learning, and we're 501(c)(3) organizations, so they're a nonprofit, and you can go out and get federal grants, and you can go out and get money from corporate foundations and such. But when you become a dean, and this was a hard lesson for me in 2010, I was a pretty young dean and didn't have much experience with university leadership, and was sort of thrown into this job, and it was very exciting, and I thought I was going to do new and exciting things. And one of the things you learn very quickly as a university administrator is that even if these organizations are not-for-profit organizations, they're corporations. I mean, they really think very carefully about how much money they have in the bank, how much money they're bringing in tuition, how much money they need for, having, and we were often told at George Washington not to use the word profit, but that's what we were working on. We had a central administration, and the central administration really put a lot of pressure on the schools like the business school and the law school and other institutions within the university to make money and increase enrollments and get more students and get more income for the school. And so you find out pretty quickly that these organizations they're corporations. Now, that being said, again, there's sort of lines in the sand. And in this case, Harvard stood its ground, and Harvard said, no, we're not going to change the way we think about how to defend our right to our own core moral ideas. And so it was a really strong position of moral leadership. And again, I don't know if it's just the difference in finances of the two places, but it's probably differences in leadership of the two institutions. And so I'm proud of Harvard and disappointed in Columbia.
But to argue on behalf of Columbia, couldn't you consider that their decision was about protecting their students and faculty in the short term? Ultimately, what is the cost to Columbia if it really saves its institution but loses its soul?
Well, yes, and I'm sure, I wasn't inside the room when people were having these arguments, but I'm sure the argument sort of went the direction that you're framing it, right? I mean, there were people probably on both sides, and the group on the side that said, we have to make decisions about protecting our institution and protecting the students and faculty in the short term. And, if this means we have to cave a little bit on the issues of how we're dealing with students that are, for example, international students, or how we're dealing with issues like student protests, and sort of how we allow freedom of expression. And we lose a little bit of that, but we maintain the institution and maintain the institution's finances. That's what we have to do. And so, again, these organizations are corporate entities, and they think about things like revenues and profits, and they think about short-term protection of their institutions versus long-term positioning. But yeah, you can make the case that you just made about Columbia, and I'm sure that there were people who made that case and they won the argument.
Well, let's talk about Harvard. In a sense, that Harvard is fighting for everyone by refusing to make those compromises.
Well, for sure. I mean, Harvard's stand challenges not just the federal government, but also encourages other institutions to reflect on what they're willing to defend. And again, these are, issues that are about learning, and they're about freedom of thought and freedom of expression. And so Harvard takes a position that really, really stands for what we believe in America and in higher education. And so I think it's laudable, what Harvard's doing.
Well, as of April 22nd, over 200 universities banded together in support of Harvard. Are they at risk of being targeted or retaliation by this administration?
Well, it's a great question, and I just before I answer your specific question, I love that thread you pointed to earlier, where the Yale student or Yale graduate said, "I'm doing something that I never thought I would do, which is giving money to Harvard. Because again, this is a market, and these institutions view themselves as competitors, and the Harvard brand versus the Yale brand, et cetera. But I think to answer your question, universities recognize how big of a threat what's happening in the Trump administration is to freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of how to be a democratic society and really encourage thoughts that you don't always believe in. And so I think that Harvard's stand, again, is really laudable, but the fact that 200 universities have banded together to support Harvard, that says a lot. And, I think if the question is, are they at risk of being targets by the administration? The administration just can't take on, the entire sector of higher education. It's just, I think eventually the fact that 200 universities are standing behind Harvard, the Trump administration is going to have to alter course. I just can't see them.
In the last few days, they already shown signs of willing to negotiate. And so the
Yeah,
David versus Goliath, I think in this case, Harvard was the David. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I agree. And to your point, like, given that it looks like they're needing to or they're showing signs of negotiating, it means that okay, so we could make an example out of Harvard, but we can't take on the entire system of higher education.
Well,
Um,
the joke around social media is that Trump administration is targeting all the elite universities that did not accept Barron Trump. He's currently at NYU. So that
right.
was kind of the joke around social media. Okay, so let's shift to big law. In return to escaping the full force of his retribution campaign, many law firms have chosen to do pro bono work for Trump-approved administrations or organizations, essentially aligning themselves with the administration's agenda. So how do you compare that to Harvard's defiance?
Well, I mean, here again, I just think I'm disappointed. And, these law firms are prioritizing their business interests or political alignment over broader societal responsibilities. And, by working with Trump-approved organizations, these firms could be seen as legitimizing policies or actions that undermine democratic norms or civil rights. I mean, the issue of, our society is really built on democratic norms and individual civil liberties, and the fact that these law firms are just suddenly uh, aligning themselves to do pro bono work for Trump-aligned organizations, I just think is despicable. And so you contrast that with Harvard's position, and they're risking financial and reputational damage to uphold the principles that benefit society at large. And so, again, I'm proud of Harvard. I think what Harvard's doing is awesome.
Well, so let's step back for a moment. So, what do these contrasting responses from Harvard, Columbia, in the law firm really tell us about leadership in today's polarized environment?
Well, it's a great question. And, this is really about moral leadership, right? And moral leadership is about taking a stand that aligns with your values, even when it's inconvenient or costly. And Harvard's showing that they're willing to put their values ahead of expediency. And, you and I have talked a lot about leadership in different contexts and different dynamics. And we look at the United States, and we look at China, and we look at different corporations. And I do think that there's a crisis of leadership in the United States right now that we can define as is on the issue on the spectrum of moral leadership. It's on a very negative side of things. I think the Trump administration is heading towards what looks like, autocratic approaches to dealing with the world, and Harvard's standing up. And they're showing that they're willing to put their values ahead of what's most expedient in terms of finances. And so I love the contrast between, I mean, there's a contrast between Harvard and Columbia, but then there's the contrast between Harvard and the law firms that you're drawing out. And I think it's awesome.
Is one better than the other? So if you think about it, Harvard is really demonstrating principled leadership. Columbia is showing that they're being very pragmatic, focusing on their immediate operational needs. And then law firms are simply self-interested. So so let's talk about this. For our audience, what lessons can we take from this leadership differentiation of different types of leadership or responses, whether in universities, businesses, or even our personal lives?
Well, so again, one of the things I would just want to be careful of is, it's great to hold Harvard up and say, this is awesome, and Columbia is buckling, and then you have the casuistic law firms that are just seeking profits. Um, and those general sketches are true. Um, but again, we have to be careful with going too deep into it, or being too critical of the players that like Columbia and the law firms, because these are businesses, and it's you got to be careful, and you got to sort of manage your finances and manage your brand. And that being said, if we were to sort of break this down, the case of Harvard is really principled leadership. And principled leadership prioritizes values and long-term societal impact. And again, Harvard is the richest university in the world, and they have the resources that they can get away with doing this. But that being said, they're also taking a stand, right? And this is principled leadership. And then, there's another part of the moral leadership spectrum that's probably more like, we could frame it as pragmatism. And I put Columbia in that box, right? Columbia is still an institution of higher learning, but they have to think about the immediate operational needs. And that's a little bit disappointing, but, it's still, they haven't given up teaching. And they haven't given up the idea of learning, but it's a little less impressive than the principled leadership of Harvard. And then we have, on the far end of the spectrum of moral leadership, we have self-interested behavior of the law firms, and these are the ones. This just looks so thin to me. And so, if I had to pick one, I would pick the principled leadership, and then kind of move on down the spectrum. I can tell you again, when I was, the dean at GW, I mean, we were a private university, and so we thought of ourselves as competitors of places like NYU and the fancy Ivy names like Columbia and Harvard. I mean, we were much lower in the rankings than those schools, and we had much less money. It was a really, really such a clear thing as the dean of a business school. When I inherited that school, we were about an $80 million a year organization, and we gave about 50% of that revenue to the central administration, because it's expensive to have real estate in Washington, D.C. And this is how the treasurer and the provost and the president talked to the deans, and we had to really think like this. And so we would have probably been pushed very hard in the direction of pragmatism, the way Columbia had been. And so, I wanted to be careful not to be too dismissive and critical, because I've been in that position. And again, the self-interest version of what the law firms are doing, that seems the worst to me. But it's a gift to see organizations that operate with principled leadership, but it's not easy. And you have to be in a very special position to be able to do it. And so,
Right. So in this case, principal leadership requires courage as well as resources, $50 billion endowment.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it's just, yeah, you can't, it does require courage, but it also requires resources, and not everybody has the same resources. So,
Well, Doug, as always, you bring so much depth to these conversations, and particularly your experience as a former dean. And I believe you were one of the youngest deans of one of the business schools, high-ranked business schools. Well, thank you for unpacking the complexity of moral leadership today. Really appreciate that.
well, thank you, Christine. I love all the conversations we have. But it's very exciting that, as you know, I love talking about China and thinking deeply about U.S.-China relations and China's role in the world. But I also love that we're sort of taking a step back and really thinking about moral leadership and what it means and how important it is, and how do we teach. As you know, I love to teach about China, but I also am a professor of leadership, and I love to think about both of these issues. And so it's great when we can expand beyond, and just think about where we are in society today. So thank you.
Thank you. That's fantastic. To our audience, what are your thoughts on the role of moral leadership in today's climate? Do you agree with Harvard's stand, or do you see the value in Columbia's pragmatism? Join the conversation, and we'll see you next time on Global Lens Conversations with Professor Doug Guthrie. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.